I have an old friend. His name is Adam. Let's call him Adam. May or may not be his name. Now, how do I know he's an old friend? Well, first of all, that used to be an expression and now it's more of an adjective. But I know he's an old friend in two ways. The first is that he's a week younger than me. So that's the first indicator that he's old. Both of us, by the way, are getting a year older within the next 10 days. The second way I know is that his daughter just graduated college. I think in May she graduated. So that's a pretty sobering thing right there. That tells us, obviously, that he's no spring chicken. Uh, so it's well established at this point that this is, in fact, an old friend. I was thinking about his daughter. And I remember years ago when she was just a baby, she was sick. Like she had a fever of some kind, 103, 104, something like that. And we were in the car, me, Adam, and his wife, and we were having a conversation. They were talking about the medicine. They were very concerned, first time parents. They were talking about the medicine they had to give her. And I said, well, why are you giving her medicine? And it seemed like a stupid question to them. I mean, well, she's sick. Of course she needs medicine, right? And I said, well, what is a fever for? Do you know, does a fever have a purpose? Do you know what the purpose of a fever is? And they said no, or they might have said, I don't remember the conversation that well, but they might have said, well, it means that she's sick. It's a bad thing. Certainly that was their interpretation, right? Just based on their actions, they were saying, in essence, that the fever was the enemy. It had to be suppressed. And I said, well, did you know that bacteria or viruses can only live in a certain environment, and that when it's very hot, they tend to die? And they were like, really? I was like, yeah. So what does that mean about the fever? And Adam said, well, I guess it's a good thing, from that perspective. And I was like, yeah. And what happens if you suppress it artificially with medications? What does that do to her ability to heal? And he said, well, that would interfere with it. I said, absolutely. I mean, this was the conversation. Now, I am under no illusion that they did not give her the medication. I'm pretty sure that they did. I don't recall. I do know that recently Adam said to me, we were having a conversation. He said, I will never forget that conversation that we had about, the fever, about the symptoms that my daughter had. And it really, it made me think. And I was pleased about that, right? Because we have a culture where symptoms are considered the enemy, where often they're the friend. I am not exactly sure about this, but I believe, if I remember it correctly, I believe that studies show that if you suppress a fever with medication, it takes longer to heal, which would make sense, right? As an interference to the healing process. Now, does that mean that we never need to suppress a fever? Certainly not. A fever, if it's out of control, can kill somebody. But it does make you think about symptoms. Now, by the way, to be very accurate, I think words are important, right? To be very accurate, a fever is not a symptom. A fever is considered a sign, right? So if you look up the definition and you look up the difference between what's a symptom and what's a sign, what you're going to discover is that a symptom is an indicator of disease or ill health that's experienced by the patient, right? It's a subjective indicator, whereas signs are things that are detected by the doctor. Generally, they're things that could be measured, right? So a fever, nobody, you have a sense when you have a fever, and maybe, you put your hand to your head, or your mom comes over and puts her lips to your head. And you know that you have a fever, but for the most part, we don't know that we have a fever unless we take a temperature. Okay, but we know we feel bad. We know maybe we're headachy. And these are, a headache is a classic symptom, right? Nausea. It's a classic symptom. Again, the distinction is whether it's subjective and experienced by the individual or it's more objective and it's detected by the practitioner. So we're being exact here, but for our purposes, we're going to just kind of lump them together, right? But now we have this data, which might be new to some people, just as it was to my friend, that a symptom can be a good thing because a symptom is part of the healing process. I think if we think of many symptoms, we could see where that's true. A fever is the classic indicator. But symptoms do have other functions also, right? Don't they inform us that there's a problem? Pardon me. There's a sign right there of something. But they do inform us that there's a problem, right? If suddenly you're walking down the street and you have a horrible pain in your leg or in your back, that's an indicator right there that something is amiss. Now, what it is, I mean, it could be a variety of things, but that's the first step in any kind of investigatory process, right? You feel something, there's something that's abnormal or that feels abnormal, even though it may not be abnormal at all. Let's think about the case of pain. Is pain abnormal? Is it a sign of abnormal function or is it a sign of normal function? If I were to park my car on your foot and you experience a great deal of pain, that's informing you that there's tissue damage and that you better do something about it before that damage becomes very, very serious. So again, from that perspective, here we have a symptom, and here it's a good thing because it's an indicator of impending death, possibly. That's why pain exists. It's to inform us about death. The death may be of cells, the death may be of the whole organism, but we need some kind of a warning system. Don't believe me? Imagine that you did not have this warning system. And in fact, there is a condition out there. I don't know what it's called. And fortunately, it's very, very rare. But there is a condition whereby children cannot experience pain. Their nervous system will not allow them to experience pain. Now, some people may at first reflexively say, boy, what a wonderful thing. Imagine never experiencing pain in your life. I can't think of anything more horrifying than that. And in practice, that's true because I got to tell you, the mothers, the parents of children who cannot experience pain at all are absolute wrecks. Think about it. Think about how weird this is, right? Because there's an understanding that the last thing you want your child to do is to experience pain. Parents martyr themselves for the sole purpose of they don't want their kid to ever experience any pain. That's what you want to do. You want to take it on yourself so that they don't have to. But in this particular situation, with this condition, the parent is afraid to ever leave the child alone, to ever stop watching them. I mean, you could turn around and before you know it, your kid is like putting his hand in a fire or leaning against something sharp. I mean, they might be cutting themselves inadvertently or advertently, possibly. And they could be bleeding all over the place, but they cannot experience that pain. They don't have that warning system that people who experience normal functioning have. That's how we're designed. So this whole idea about not experiencing symptoms, about not experiencing signs, which, by the way, I want to be careful with my words here. because I'm tempted to say, which is the goal of Western medicine? I don't think that it is the goal, but it is the goal of salespeople, of marketing people, of pharmaceutical companies, right? To tell us that all symptoms are abnormal. And if you're experiencing a symptom, you have to get rid of it, and you get rid of it by taking something. Medications can save lives. Sometimes the suppression of symptoms are necessary. There is a level of pain that human beings cannot deal with. I experienced it once. I don't want to experience it again. At that point, I would have taken anything. I would have done anything. But when that becomes the end all be all, when that becomes the goal, now we have a problem. And great salespeople know this. And believe me when I tell you that the greatest salespeople in the world are in the pharmaceutical companies. And this is not conspiracy theory stuff. The fact of the matter is that Americans are 5% of the world's populations, yet spend 60% of the money in the world for pharmaceuticals, for medications. And with the worst health outcomes of all the developed nations. So there is a problem there, and you could see how that problem starts out as a philosophical problem. It starts out with misdefinitions of words and misunderstandings that result from it. So now we're left with the question, are symptoms good? Because aren't symptoms sometimes indicators of terrible, terrible things? Right? So they're good in the sense that they indicate, but what do they mean, and when do we intervene? We don't always know what they mean, right? We don't always know when to leave something alone. I did not tell my friend, don't give your child any medication. That wasn't my place. But I felt it was my place to have a discussion about him, to just have him, give him a better understanding so he can make a decision with more data. So again, we're back to this question. When do we intervene? Do we intervene in a fever when it's 103 degrees? There is a idea. There is a computation that people make. And it's something like this. Well, it's just not worth it. Let's not find out. Why bother when we have these medications that we could take? And for the most part, they're going to work. They're going to do what they're supposed to do, right? If we have a medication that is designed to suppress a fever, well, why not just take it? Because people have died from fevers. If your fever gets to 109, you're a goner. Right? Kids are probably okay with a relatively high fever, like 105. I mean, something that would alarm adults, but kids tend to run hot. So what do we do in these cases? Because we know that the problem is not the symptom. They're not the same thing. If we're thinking we know this, if we're making distinctions, we know this. We know that there's a cause and there's an effect, and that the symptom is the effect, even though it's sold to us as the cause, as the problem, as the thing to be addressed. And even though sometimes it is. So what do? I don't have a guide for that. There is no one rule that can tell you exactly what that is. And as a matter of fact, nobody has. That I'm aware of, nobody has that guide. Practitioners practice in different ways. You could see how this understanding and this distinction between symptoms and actual health problems, right, which aren't the same thing, although they go hand in hand, you could see how that leads to different approaches by practitioners, because some practitioners think their job is to get rid of that symptom. Some patients beg their doctors to do exactly that. Not look to see the malfunction, not look to find that and address that, but merely to get rid of that uncomfortable symptom. Because even though symptoms aren't necessarily bad, even though sometimes they're just outright good, they generally feel bad. No one wants to feel bad. Someone once told me that the difference between people and animals is that when an animal is sick, it eats grass and it lays down and goes to sleep. When a human being is sick, it ingests pills and goes to work. So who's smarter? I'll let you figure that one out. Okay? But again, if we're talking philosophically, if we're talking about understanding when it comes to practitioners and what a practitioner, how a practitioner interprets their role, right? It has everything to do with their understanding of what health is and what indicators are. A so-called holistic or alternative practitioner understands that the body is a self-regulating, self-healing organism. And therefore, the job is to not get rid of the symptom that may be designed to help with that self-regulating, self-healing process, but to assist the body with that, regardless of symptoms. Okay? As a chiropractor, I can tell you an adjustment can be uncomfortable. But an adjustment, a lot of interventions can be uncomfortable. If it wasn't for the presence of anesthetics, believe me, surgery would be uncomfortable. But that's what a holistic practitioner is trying to do. It's trying to assist the body with its own self-regulating capacity because it's what does the healing. Every time you've cut yourself in your life, if things are functioning properly, it has healed. And it's not the Band-Aid, and it's not whatever you put it on to clean up the wound. That is not what does the healing. So that process is always happening. And I've discussed this before, but think of the absurdity of assuming that we are not self-healing, that we have this thing called life, and yet we don't have the capacity to sustain it. Nobody would make it past their first week if that were the case. It's absurd. Non-holistic practitioners, sometimes called allopathic practitioners, don't always practice this way. They're not necessarily trying to assist the body's self-healing capacity. They are often trying to assist with the symptoms or to do some kind of an intervention that comes from the outside in. Occasionally, that is assisting the body with healing. More often than not, it's trying to do for the body what it's either not doing, or it may do if given enough time and patience. I'll give you an example, right? I'll give you a couple of examples to elucidate this point. If a thyroid is malfunctioning, cutting the thyroid out, taking it out, is not an intervention that's going to assist with healing. It may or may not be the wise thing to do. That's not the point. You know, certainly if there's some kind of a tumor or cancer, right, you can definitely see why that might be wise. But just if it's malfunctioning, if you take it out, that's not going to work. Giving thyroid replacement hormone is not an intervention that will assist the healing of the thyroid. It does what the thyroid is not doing. And it actually can be a disincentive for the thyroid to heal. Again, no judgment, not good or bad. You know, sometimes the thyroid is just not working, and it makes sense to, you know, give that replacement hormone. But that should not be confused with actual healing. It's two different things, replacing and healing. Does that make sense? Okay. Conversely, if you break your arm and you go to a doctor and then he kind of sets it and puts it in a cast, that will assist the healing. The doctor understands in that case that the mending is not done by any medication, right? It's not done by surgery, although surgery may be needed to put the ends together. He understands that there is a natural ability for bones to mend, for them to grow back together, but they have to be aligned correctly. So that is an intervention that will assist with healing. It's more rare that quote unquote allopathic practitioners, right, will function in that way. Now, the word allopathic is not a word that's used commonly. Allopathic, allo kind of means opposite, right? Against. Person has a high fever, you bring it down. Person has high blood pressure, you bring it down. Low blood pressure, you do something to bring it up, right? You do the opposite. Then there's a term, the opposite of that is a homeopathic, right? And homeo means the same. Someone's experiencing nausea, so you give them something that would otherwise make them nauseous. But the idea is that's provoking a response from the body that will then be a healing response. Okay, so these are just like kind of important distinctions. I don't think we're being too here's a $10 word, pedantic, right? Emphasizing little distinctions too much. I think these are very important distinctions when it comes to understanding, right? So again, there is no absolute rule or guide that I know of that should tell you absolutely when a medical intervention should be done, when it should not, when you should allow the body to, do its thing, and when you shouldn't. Medical doctors used to have an expression, and the practice of medicine, I think, has changed over the years, but they used to say, our job is to humor the patient while the body does the healing. I think that's changed over the years, and in part, it's the patients. The patients come in demanding an intervention. I would submit that we are compulsive interveners when it comes to natural processes and it comes to health and healing in this country. We think that's the way to go. Better living through chemistry. Intervention seems to be the default position. Now, it's up to you to decide whether or not it should be. But hopefully these understandings, the stuff that we're talking about now, will give you a better idea for that. If you find yourself, as is going to happen, by the way, a lot of people are coming down with COVID right now. I know several. I missed out on a vacation last weekend because a family member had COVID. I'm PO'd at her. It's going to be a nice weekend. I'm glad I didn't go. I just didn't feel like dealing with that. Would I have contracted it? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But I just didn't feel like taking that chance, right? I intend to get COVID between Christmas and New Year's, or right around then. That'll be a convenient time. It's what happened, I think, the last couple of years. So this way I could do it at a time where there's not a lot going on. I could just chill and be done with it. Right. But there is a lot of COVID happening right now. And this question as to what to do about it, whether to do anything at all, it definitely seems to be less lethal than it was. Although I don't know, there's just not that much attention on it right now, like there used to be. Right. Which makes sense. But it's my sense that it is a lot less lethal now. And so more people than not who I know, they're not going to get tested now. They are just experiencing it. They understand they have symptoms. It may be some kind of a flu, it may be COVID, and every other time they've been sick like that in their lives, for the most part, it's gotten better. They may or may not take something to make them feel better. Um, but intervention seems to be a lot less than it was in the past. Okay. So, the next time you get sick, you may or may not remember this conversation that we had. I have no position. I am completely agnostic on it as to what you should do. But I want you to have the understanding, um, symptoms and signs are not always bad. Okay. Now, that is not to say that they should not be investigated. They should be investigated because they are always indicators, not always indicators of something terrible. A hangnail could be painful. A hangnail is generally not fatal. Okay. It should always be investigated. So remember, I'm saying this, right? It should always be investigated. Certainly, if it's something is going on for some time that otherwise you would have expected to have gotten better, to have run its course and gotten better. So symptoms and signs should always be investigated, whether or not you decide to do something. Should always do something. Whether that's eat better or start to exercise or what have you. But whether you decide to do something that's a more extreme or serious intervention, that's a different story altogether. Find out, discover whatever data there is to discover. Find out, hopefully, what it means. Listen, years ago, many years ago now, my father had a thing on his leg. I went with him to the doctor. He was not going to go and do anything about it, right? It was his wife at the time who suggested he go. Well, it turns out it was cancer. It was skin cancer, and that's what ultimately took his life. Okay. So that particular sign right there, should have been investigated sooner than it was. He might have had a better chance. And that happens all the time, right? There is an expectation that if we have something that doesn't seem right or normal, that it will get better, because it generally does, because of what I was saying before. We do have this capacity to heal, right? Sometimes we don't want to know the information. We don't want to confront it. So all non-optimal signs and symptoms should be investigated. Regarding intervention, and the type of intervention and what should be done, that's a different story. And that's something you can make your mind up once you have all the data. But hopefully this conversation is a better understanding about signs and symptoms. The title of this particular talk today was something like, I forgot exactly what I wrote, but we love symptoms. We don't love experiencing symptoms, but as a society, we love symptoms, right? A lot of people make a lot of money because of symptoms. That is the main marketing goal. You discover a symptom that's uncomfortable and unwanted, and you create a product that will address it. Not necessarily any malfunction that's causing it, but the symptom itself, and you sell that product. You find a pain point. Okay, so we love symptoms in that sense. It drives our economy. All right, that's going to be it for today. Everyone have a fantastic week, and I will speak to you next week. Take care.